she brought her piggy bank to an auction. What the dog did next changed everything. The auction house was noisy boots stomping on concrete, loud laughter, cattle pens clanging shut. But in the corner stood a girl, small, silent, clutching a glass jar filled with exactly $52 shoved. No one noticed her until she raised her hand. They laughed, thought it was a mistake, a child playing grown-up games. But then the crate rattled. Inside, a scarred German shepherd stood up, his body stiff, his ears alert. And in front of a room full of hardened adults and high-stakes bidders, he crashed his crate open and ran straight to her. That's when the room went quiet. Because what no one knew, what the men in suits, the town's council, and the masked powers behind the auction didn't expect, was that this little girl had once whispered to that very dog through a fence every night after her mother died. And the dog, he never forgot. This is the story of Echo, a retired canine thrown away like old equipment, and Aria, the girl who couldn't speak until the night she screamed his name. The sky over Havenbrook was a hard blue that morning, so sharp it almost felt like it could shatter. Sunlight pressed against the county fairgrounds with a weight that made everything shimmer and sweat. Popcorn oil clung to the air. The buzzing of rides and laughter from strangers spun like cotton candy around booths and banners. It was the kind of day meant for joy, bright and loud and filled with sugar and noise. But for Aria Bennett, it might as well have been made of glass. She stood small and still at the entrance to the main pavilion, a pale figure in a navy dress with frayed sleeves and knees scabbed from weeks of walking barefoot where no one thought to mow the grass. Her hair was neatly combed, pinned back the way her mother used to do, though one lock had escaped and curled into her eyes. She didn't brush it away. She didn't do anything, really, except grip the glass jar clutched tightly to her chest. The coins inside dimes from birthday cards, quarters from lemonade stands, 2 silver dollars her mother once gave her, just because, clinked softly with each step. She had counted them that morning, $52.16. Her hands, knuckles white around the glass, trembled slightly. Not from fear, from purpose. Because today wasn't about rides or funnel cake. Today was for Echo. Aria hadn't spoken aloud since the morning 2 officers showed up at their door in pressed uniforms and solemn eyes. That was 11 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days ago. Words had simply left her. And everyone, even the kind ones, had stopped waiting for them to come back. Except for him. Echo, her mother's partner in the K-9 unit, a German shepherd with eyes too knowing for comfort, and a scar across his back left leg where he'd taken a blade meant for Officer Nora Bennett. They used to be a team, Nora and Echo and Nora, until Havenbrook changed, until the river behind their house started to smell like bleach, until her mother started coming home later, staying quieter, keeping locked files and saying things like, "We're close, Echo, just a few more nights," until that last call. The static-laced radio transmission that ended with Nora's voice breaking mid-sentence, until the knock on the door. After that, Echo was taken to the department kennel. Official reasoning, he was still property of the police force. But Aria remembered the way he howled the day they drove him away. The sound wild, confused, broken. No one knew she had been visiting him every night since. She would sneak out her window after Sarah, her mom's wife, and Sarah's new partner, Tyler, had gone to sleep. She'd cross 2 fields, slip past the volunteer fire station, and sit by the chain-link fence of the kennel where Echo paced alone. She never brought food or toys. She only brought her silence. and he listened like he understood. She told him everything about the way her chest hurt, about the way people kept telling her to move on, about how she kept hearing her mother's voice in dreams, muffled like it was behind glass. Echo would sit, tail brushing the dirt, and rest his head against the fence. That was enough. Until last Tuesday, when she overheard Tyler at the kitchen table talking too loud into his phone. The auction Saturday. Yeah. Retired canine. I guess it's protocol. Some guy from Halcyon Securities showing up to bid. Big money. Dog's got a history. That night, Aria didn't cry. She counted her coins. Now, standing at the edge of the crowd as the livestock auction unfolded, she felt like her heart was no longer inside her body. It was inside that crate, across the dusty lot, where Echo waited. The fair smelled like fried dough, hay, and faintly of sunburnt metal. Voices blurred together in heat-warped echoes. Laughter came too easy here. No one noticed the girl with the jar. No one noticed how tightly she held it. But Echo would. He always did. She stepped forward, her sneakers too big for her feet and caked with dry mud. Each footfall felt heavy, like it might break the earth. Her knees shook, but not from fear. She scanned the signs for the retired K9 auction pavilion, a long white tent near the livestock pens, barely marked except for a crooked handwritten banner, "Honoring Service Dogs." It made her stomach twist. A man bumped into her as she passed, muttering something under his breath about kids with sticky fingers. She didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that some people were just loud to hear themselves, that the quiet ones carried heavier things, like truth and memory and grief. As the pavilion came into view, she saw him Echo, in a crate far too small for his size, panting in the heat, his ears flicking toward her even from a distance. He stood slowly, pressed his nose against the bars. Her grip on the jar tightened. This wasn't just about getting her dog back. It was about the last piece of her mother she could still reach. Behind her, the music from the carousel played something cheerful and wrong. Ahead, the man in a starched blue shirt adjusted his tie and stepped onto the small wooden stage. The auction was moments away from beginning, and Aria, silent, trembling, determined, stepped toward it, the weight of every coin in that jar echoing louder than the noise of the entire fair. The inside of the auction pavilion smelled like sawdust and sun-baked metal. A faded American flag hung from one beam overhead, its edges curled from years of heat and humidity. Wood creaked under every footstep. The crowd murmured in restless waves, bidders, clutching folded brochures, kids licking melting ice cream cones, an old man flipping a coin over and over between his fingers like he was counting seconds instead of dollars. And at the far end of the room, under a hand-painted sign that read, "Retired Canine Auction Honoring Our Heroes," there was a crate, steel bars, scratched and dulled, a water bowl barely half full, and behind them, Echo. He sat quietly, regal even in confinement, his ears alert and eyes steady. A thin scar cut across his back left leg, the only visible sign of what he'd given. His coat, though touched with gray at the muzzle, was still thick and dark as river stone. His posture wasn't nervous or agitated. It was watchful, like he was waiting for something or someone. And then he saw her. Across the crowd, through the blur of bodies and banners, Echo's eyes locked with Aria's. He stood, just that. No bark, no whine. He stood and stared. Aria didn't move, didn't blink. Her hands curled around the jar, pressing it so tight the coins inside stopped clinking. A heat welled in her chest, not from the summer air, but from the weight of memory. She saw Echo, not in a cage, but as he had been, trotting beside her mother in uniform, sitting stoically on their front porch as sirens blared in the distance, nose nudging Aria's shoulder when she refused to eat, when the grief sat so heavy she couldn't lift a fork. She remembered the first night she'd found him again, weeks after the funeral, inside the gated yard behind the police station, his silhouette pacing in the dark. She had crept there with nothing but a flashlight and a blanket, afraid he'd forgotten her. But he hadn't. He'd come straight to the fence, tail low but wagging, pressed his nose through the chain link, and rested his forehead against her tiny palm. That night she had whispered her first word in weeks, not to a person, but to him. Hi. Every night after that she came back. She told him things she never told Sarah, about how she hated being called brave when all she felt was broken, about how she didn't like Tyler's loud shoes or the way he never looked at the pictures of Mom on the mantel, about how she still woke up expecting to hear her mother's boots in the hallway, her voice calling out, "Echo, come!" But the house stayed quiet. Only the dog remembered. Only the dog had stayed. Now he was in a crate like a piece of used equipment, waiting for the highest bidder to decide his fate. Aria took one step closer. Echo didn't move. But something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or memory. Or something deeper that didn't need a name. She reached the edge of the pen and crouched low, the jar still in her lap. The bars were too close together to reach through. But she didn't try. Instead, she did what she'd always done. She whispered, soft, incomplete, but real. "I'm here." Echo's tail moved, slow and low against the crate floor. "They're going to try and take you, but I won't let them." He leaned forward until his muzzle pressed between the bars, and for a moment Aria thought he might whine. But he didn't. He just breathed, and she breathed with him. Then the microphone crackled. A man with a sunburnt neck and an over-gelled comb-over stepped onto the stage at the front of the pavilion. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, we're about to begin today's very special auction." People shuffled toward the benches. Folding chairs scraped wood. A few men bidders adjusted their belts or whispered numbers into phones. Aria didn't move. The announcer continued, voice overly cheerful. "This here is Echo, 5 years of service. Former K-9 with the Haven Brook PD, served alongside the late Officer Nora Bennett, retired after her passing. Well-trained, loyal, and ready for the next chapter in his life." A woman behind Aria murmured, "Poor dog. Shame about that officer. She was a good one." Someone else chuckled. $10 says Halcyon Security takes him. They've been collecting trained dogs like baseball cards." Aria's fists clenched. She turned back to Echo. He was still staring at her. Not the crowd, not the stage, only her. The man on the microphone raised his gavel. "We'll start the bidding at $500. The crowd leaned forward. A hand shot up. And Aria, with the jar of coins in her lap and a storm building in her chest, whispered the only thing that mattered. "Please, don't forget me." Echo blinked once, then lowered his body to the crate floor, resting his head against the bars nearest her knees, like he was saying, "Never." The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air like a threat-polished wood, waiting to fall. "Do I hear $500? The man called out again, his voice smooth but practiced. The kind that had sold livestock, tractors, and furniture for decades, without caring much what they meant to anyone. A hand rose near the backball cap, work boots, no emotion. "500, the bidder muttered. The gavel twitched, ready to drop. But before it did, another voice cut in, sharp and precise like a scalpel. 1,000. Heads turned. He stood near the center aisle, the sun catching the silver in his hair. Crisp white shirt, expensive shoes, unsuited for gravel. Marcus Vane, director of security at Halcyon Industries. The kind of man who didn't just walk into a room. He calculated it. Aria didn't know his name, but she knew the type. People who smiled without warmth. People who spoke in clipped tones and made her skin crawl. Her mother had mentioned Halcyon once. Too many secrets under too many locks, she'd said, eyes tight. Now here was their man, bidding on Echo. Next to Aria, Echo didn't stir, but his ears twitched. The auctioneer's voice brightened. 1,000 do I hear, 1,500? A beat passed. Then from the front row, a voice rang out, rougher, slower. 15. The man who spoke didn't stand. He sat with his elbows on his knees, hands like slabs of weathered oak. Elijah Ward, a rancher from the outskirts of town, known more for being left alone than anything else. Flannel shirt, beat-up hat, eyes like storm clouds. Nobody knew why he was here. Certainly not Aria. But Echo lifted his head at the sound of the man's voice. Not alert, not alarmed. Just listening. The bidding continued. 20. 25. Each number dragged the air tighter around Aria's chest. The jar in her lap suddenly felt ridiculous, like bringing a paper kite to a wildfire. She looked down at the $52.16 she had carried for weeks with stubborn hope. And then she stood up. Small, pale, quiet. The kind of quiet that makes people stop talking. "I want to bid," she whispered. The room fell still. The auctioneer blinked, thrown off rhythm. Sweetheart, what's your name?" She swallowed. Aria Bennett. The name rippled. The town remembered. Some faces softened. Others looked away. "And what's your bid, Aria?" She stepped forward, slowly. Each step made the coins in her jar clink like tiny bells at a funeral. $52.16. Someone in the back snorted. A woman near the aisle coughed into a laugh. Marcus smirked. The auctioneer, to his credit, stepped down from the platform and knelt, taking the jar like it was a sacred thing instead of pocket change. "Thank you, honey. Truly. But I'm afraid—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The gavel rose again. Aria turned to leave. The humiliation roared in her ears, but she didn't cry. She had nothing left to cry out of. Then a bark, sharp, unmistakable. Echo! The sound cracked through the barn like thunder on a blue sky day. And then came the crash. Echo slammed his weight into the side of the crate, once, twice. On the third hit, the latch buckled with a metallic snap, and the crate door burst open. "Hey!" someone shouted. An officer stepped forward, but stopped. Because Echo wasn't running wild, he was running to her. Across the sawdust floor, paws thudding like a drumbeat. The crowd parted as if by instinct. Chairs scraped. People gasped. Aria didn't move. When Echo reached her, he didn't bark again. He didn't jump or whine. He simply pressed his head into her chest and exhaled. And something in the room shifted. In the hush that followed, even Marcus Vane went still. Elijah Ward slowly leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. Someone murmured, "He chose her." The auctioneer looked at the officer near the stage, then back at the girl and the dog still standing like a statue carved from memory and mourning. He lowered the gavel. We're going to take a short break, folks." Echo didn't look back at the crate, and Arya, after 11 months of silence, after every whispered word to the stars and the fences and the grave bent slightly, wrapped her arms around the dog's thick neck and finally let her eyes close. She had lost her mother, but she had not lost him. The gavel didn't fall. It hung suspended in the auctioneer's hand like the blade of a guillotine, waiting for gravity or permission. Around him the pavilion buzzed not with excitement, but with the strange static of a crowd that had just witnessed something sacred and didn't quite know what to do with it. Echo, the retired police dog, sat calmly beside Arya Bennett, his head still nestled against the hollow of her chest, his body still and watchful like a sentinel who had chosen his post. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Folks, we're going to take a short recess while we, clarify the situation. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. They weren't clarifying anything. They were figuring out what to do when a dog disobeyed the law to do something right." Arya stood silently, one hand resting on Echo's neck, the other still curled around the lip of the now empty glass jar. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the man with the gavel. She only looked at him, and Echo looked back like they'd been speaking this way forever. Then, as if summoned by the crackle of unease in the room, Marcus Vane stepped forward. His shoes clicked against the wood like punctuation marks. He moved with confidence, precision. There was no dust on his cuffs, no warmth in his eyes. He didn't look at Arya, not once. Instead, he addressed the auctioneer. "I'd like to formally raise my bid," he said, voice as smooth as cold oil. $10,000, payable today, wire transfer, immediate clearance. A sharp inhale swept through the pavilion. Someone muttered, "10,000? For a retired dog?" Marcus didn't react, because it wasn't about Echo. It never had been. From the back row, Elijah Ward slowly stood. His flannel shirt was wrinkled. His boots were caked with dry earth. He didn't carry a briefcase or a company name. He didn't speak with polish. But when he opened his mouth, the room listened. "I'll offer 4,000 cash," he said. "And I'll add one more thing. He won't be kenneled. He won't be leashed. He'll sleep inside, near a warm stove, near the little girl who's the only thing he's got left." Someone in the crowd clapped, but stopped when Marcus Vane turned his gaze that way just long enough to remind them that some men carried power like a blade. The auctioneer looked like he wanted to disappear. "The policy, as posted, says that retired canine units are considered department property. They're to be auctioned to the highest qualified bidder, with proceeds going to fund future training." "But that dog made a choice," someone said. "He ain't a toaster," someone else added. "He ain't surplus." From the corner, a woman in a sheriff's uniform stepped forward. Officer Grady, mid-40s, with tired eyes and a badge polished more out of habit than pride. She kept her voice low but firm. There's precedent," she said, "a clause buried in the department's retirement policy. In cases of exceptional attachment or behavioral risk, the unit may be reassigned outside of auction." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Behavioral risk?" "He broke a containment crate," Grady replied, "in front of 50 witnesses. If that crate had held a more aggressive dog, we'd be looking at injuries." "And yet," Marcus said, "he didn't injure anyone, did he?" "No," Grady said, "but he chose. And if we force him away from her now—" Her voice faltered, just enough to betray something personal. "I've seen dogs give up after losing a partner. Some stop eating, some run, some just fade." Arya remained still. Echo didn't flinch. He simply laid one paw gently over the toe of her shoe-like punctuation. Marcus turned to the crowd now, addressing no one and everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an auction, a legal one. This department needs funding. And whether you like me or not, I'm playing by the rules. $10,000 means 2 more pups trained, 2 more lives saved. That little girl's sentiment doesn't outweigh that." It was delivered perfectly, polished, dangerous, convincing at least to someone who didn't know what grief smelled like, what loyalty sounded like when it barked just once, sharp and sure. Elijah stepped forward again. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked at Marcus. "You ever lose someone and still hear their voice when it's quiet?" he asked. Marcus didn't reply. "'Cause that's what she hears," Elijah went on, nodding toward Arya. "Every night. And that dog, he's the only one still listening back. You can outbid her, but you can't outlove her." The room held its breath. The auctioneer adjusted his tie, eyes darting between the policy sheet and the people. He looked to the girl, to the dog, to the crowd, torn between law and instinct. And somewhere from the back, a voice called out, "Let the dog decide." The silence that followed the last bid didn't feel natural. It wasn't the hush of resolution, it was the stillness before something breaks. All eyes turned to Echo, who had planted himself beside Arya like a statue. Not pacing, not whining, just sitting there, resolute, eyes tracking every movement around them like he knew exactly what was at stake. The auctioneer shifted uneasily on the platform. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Mr. Vane," he said hesitantly, "you're the high bidder. Legally, he's yours." Marcus Vane stepped forward, the leather of his shoes whispering across the wooden floor. His smile was small and surgical. "Good," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a black leather leash, coiled tight like a promise. "Come on, Echo," he called, voice low, professional, the way one might speak to a trained dog. "Let's go." He held the leash out. Echo didn't move, didn't blink, didn't turn his head. He sat beside Arya with the stillness of a monument and the weight of memory. Marcus's jaw tensed. He's trained. He'll obey. He took a step closer, and Echo's ears snapped forward. His body tensed, not aggressive but unmistakably protective. A sound rumbled low in his throat. Not a growl. Not quite. Just warning. One more step, and Marcus might have found out what came next. But he didn't take it. Instead, Elijah Ward stepped into the space between them. "I wouldn't," he said quietly. Marcus turned slow and cold. "Excuse me? I wouldn't push him," Elijah said again. "Not when he's made up his mind." "This isn't a movie, cowboy," Marcus replied, voice clipped. "It's a transaction. The dog doesn't get a vote." But Echo remained unmoved. His tail lay flat. His eyes were sharp, fixed, ready. The only command he was waiting for wasn't Marcus's. It was Arya's. The girl said nothing. She hadn't spoken since her bid, soft and trembling and too small to fill the space. But her silence now was louder than any scream. She didn't hold Echo back. She didn't clutch him or cry. She simply stood beside him, still, calm, unreadable, and he mirrored her. Two souls broken in different ways, holding each other steady in front of the people who'd call that a technicality. The murmurs began again in the crowd. "He won't go. Look at him. He's choosing. She doesn't even need a leash." Officer Grady, who had been lingering near the side of the stage, finally stepped forward. She looked older in that moment, not in years, but in weight, like she was carrying something invisible but heavy. "There's one option," she said, mostly to the auctioneer, but loud enough for the room. "It's not common, but it exists. If the canine exhibits post-traumatic bonding that may interfere with reassignment, the department can override the auction and retire him directly to the care of a civilian." The auctioneer blinked. Is that official policy?" "It's buried deep," Grady replied. "But it's there, meant for cases where the animal might be a danger to himself or others if removed." "And you're saying that applies here?" Marcus challenged. Grady looked at Echo, at Aria, at the tension between them and the rest of the world. "I'm saying," she said slowly, "that trying to force that dog away from her is the kind of mistake people don't walk away from without scars." Marcus turned his attention to Aria for the first time, really looked at her. The small girl with scraped knees, one undone shoelace, and a jar of coins that was now empty. She didn't flinch under his gaze, didn't cower. She just stood there, unshakable in her silence. And that silence said everything. This isn't about rules. This isn't about money. This is about what's left of her mother and the only living creature who remembers her the same way. Marcus lowered the leash. His smile never reached his eyes. "Then override it," he said flatly. "If you're so sure it's the right call." Grady hesitated. The weight of the badge on her chest suddenly seemed heavier. "It's not that simple," she admitted. "We'd need a departmental vote, and the chief's not here. He's out of state." "So you'd rather let sentiment dictate policy?" Marcus said, voice sharp now. "That's not law. That's weakness." From the crowd, someone muttered, "No, that's humanity." And then the voice rose louder. "Let the people decide." Grady looked at the crowd, at Aria, at Echo. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. The room began to shift slowly toward something that wasn't in the handbook. And Echo? He simply leaned a little closer to Aria, letting his body touch hers. A small, silent promise. "I'm not going. Not without you." The silence that fell over the pavilion now wasn't awkward. It was sacred. It hung like mist in the rafters, clinging to every wooden beam, every breath held back. The kind of silence that comes not from uncertainty, but from the recognition that something important was unfolding. The auctioneer, an older man named Harlan Dempsey, whose job had always been numbers, gavel, and order, removed his glasses and rubbed them against his vest. His hands trembled slightly. He looked down at the clipboard that still bore Marcus Vane's $10,000 bid, the ink barely dry. And then he looked up at the child, Aria standing with her hands still on the sides of her worn dress, silent, unmoving. The coins she'd once clutched, now forgotten at her feet, scattered like the last hope of someone who had no backup plan. And beside her, Echo, the German shepherd with the scar on his leg and the weight of a broken oath in his eyes, sat like stone. Not for sale. Not anymore. Dempsey cleared his throat. "Folks," he said slowly, voice strained from something heavier than age, "this auction wasn't supposed to be complicated." He looked at Marcus, who stood like a shadow, tall and coiled, his sleek suit too sharp for a place that smelled of hay and popcorn. "But this ain't a steer or a tractor we're dealing with," Dempsey continued. "This is a dog, a working dog, a partner, a hero, and it's clear. He's already made his choice." Murmurs ran like wind through the crowd. Heads nodded, a few sniffles. A woman clutched her child tighter. Dempsey set the clipboard down. "Now, I've run this auction 10 years straight, and I ain't never broken protocol. But I also ain't never seen a dog do what this one just did." He hesitated, then looked toward Officer Grady. She gave him a silent nod, permission unspoken, but understood. "So here's what I propose," Dempsey said, voice louder now. "We take a vote. Right here. Right now. One side of the barn for those who say law is law. Highest bid wins. The other side for those who believe this little girl's already won something money can't buy." The air shifted. No one moved at first. Then an elderly man stood, a veteran by his faded jacket and the way he walked with more memory than muscle. He tipped his hat toward Aria, then stepped quietly to her side. One by one, others followed. The school librarian, the grocer with a limp, the teenager who cleaned stalls on weekends, mothers with children, farmers with mud still on their boots, even Elijah Ward, who had remained still as stone since Echo had broken the crate, walked over without a word, his step slow but certain. Soon one side of the barn was full, and the other, Marcus's side, stood nearly empty. Just two men in black suits, both of whom shifted uncomfortably like they'd wandered into the wrong kind of war. Marcus Vane's jaw clenched. "This is absurd," he said. "You're letting emotion override law." Dempsey picked up the gavel. "Sometimes," he said softly, "law forgets who it was made for." Marcus stepped forward, a sharp blade of presence slicing through the crowd's fragile hope. "You think this settles anything? You've just embarrassed the wrong man." He turned toward Aria, then really turned and looked down at her like a man inspecting something beneath him. "You just bought yourself a problem, little girl." But before another word could be spoken, Echo rose. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply stepped forward between Aria and Marcus and stood still, his head slightly low, ears high, eyes locked on Marcus like he'd seen this kind of threat before, like he remembered. Marcus paused, then turned to go. "You'll regret this," he muttered as he disappeared through the barn doors, suit flapping behind him like a warning flag. The door slammed shut. And then, without anyone commanding it, Echo leaned against Aria. Not like a guard, like a promise. Dempsey raised the gavel slowly. "By the will of the people of Havenbrook," he said, voice steadier now, "Echo belongs to Miss Aria Bennett." The gavel dropped, and in that one sound, a soft crack of finality, the room exhaled. Applause didn't break out. Instead, something quieter rippled through the barn. Tears, gentle nods, a few whispers of thank God, and she did it. And Aria? She knelt down beside Echo, placed both small hands on either side of his face, and rested her forehead gently against his. No words, just breath, and the deep, unshakable rhythm of a bond that had outlived death, policy, and fear. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like it, too, had been holding its breath. The door creaked open, and the house seemed to inhale. It was the first time Echo had crossed this threshold since Nora Bennett had left and never returned. And yet, nothing had changed inside, not really. The sun still filtered softly through the faded curtains. Dust motes floated like tiny ghosts caught in golden shafts of light. And the scent, faint but familiar. Soap, cedarwood, something warm, something hers. Echo stepped cautiously, his paws clicking softly against the hardwood. His body was leaner now, older, but his gait still held the echo of a soldier's march. And as he crossed into the living room, he paused, nose lifting. There it was, Nora's chair. It sat in the corner, slightly askew, just as she'd left it. A crocheted blanket, half-finished, hung limply over the arm. The cushion bore the faint imprint of her weight, like the memory of her hadn't quite gotten up and walked away. Echo approached slowly. He sniffed once, then again, his nose trembling, and then he let out a low, heart-wrenching whine. Not loud, just enough to fill the room with everything that hadn't been said. Aria, barefoot and silent, stood behind him in the doorway. She didn't call to him. She didn't reach. Instead, she sat on the floor, crisscrossed, and watched him with wide, glassy eyes. Her jar of coins still rested on the porch. She hadn't wanted to bring it inside. Maybe because she knew this wasn't a place where things could be bought, only remembered. Echo circled once beneath Nora's chair, then pressed his body against the leg of it, as if anchoring himself to the last place her presence had lived. Later he rose again and walked to the back door. He sat, waited, and whined. Aria, understanding more in silence than most could in words, slipped off the latch and opened it. The screen door flapped behind them with a soft whump as they stepped out into the fading light. The backyard was overgrown now. Weeds curled around the edge of the porch. A rusted bicycle lay on its side beneath the mulberry tree, long forgotten. But Echo didn't hesitate. He moved forward down the slope, past the overgrown fence line, toward the trail Nora used to walk each morning. Aria followed, brushing past tall grass and remembering how her mother's boots used to press patterns into the dirt. Echo didn't look back. He knew where he was going, and she was beginning to remember. The trail bent hard to the left, past the blackberry bramble, and there it was, the creek. It still ran shallow, whispering over stones, its surface dappled with the reflection of cottonwood leaves and sky. Echo stepped into it, just barely wetting his paws, and then stood still, as if waiting or listening. Aria crouched beside him, dipping her fingers into the cool water. She remembered coming here with her mom, picnic lunches, laughter, the way Nora would let Echo roam without a leash because she always trusted him to return. But this time was different. Echo sniffed the air. His tail flicked once. Then he padded upstream, nose close to the ground. He paused beside a rotted log and stared at it, long and hard. Aria approached, expecting something. A squirrel? A snake? Nothing. Just stillness. Echo gave a low huff, circled the log once, then trotted back to her side. He touched his nose gently to her hand, then turned around, ready to go back. It wasn't until later that night, when Aria sat at the kitchen table with a crayon and the back of an envelope, that she began to draw. Her lines were jagged, messy, but deliberate. She marked the trail, the bend in the creek, the log. She circled it with red, just like her mother used to. She didn't speak, not even when Sarah asked gently what she was drawing. But she didn't have to, because as she pressed the last mark into the paper, Echo curled on the rug near the back door, lifted his head and stared at her. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them. Something ancient, something true. It was a ritual, a memory, a message, and it had just begun again. The package arrived with no return address. It was wrapped in a thick layer of brown butcher paper, the corners damp from dew and something darker mud, maybe. It had been left on the front porch while the family slept. No knock, no doorbell, just the quiet thud of something being placed with care or caution. Sarah Bennett found it first. She stood in the doorway in her robe, one hand gripping her coffee mug, the other clutching the envelope as if it might bleed. Inside was a simple leather-bound notebook, worn, scuffed, the kind with edges that curled from being thumbed through too many times. A black elastic band, half snapped, still clung to one corner. On the front cover, faint but unmistakable, were the initials burned into the leather. N.B. Nora Bennett. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling as she opened it. Aria stood behind her silently, one small hand resting on Echo's back. The pages smelled like pine and old paper, like memories too long buried. The first page was plain, then a scrawled note in Nora's handwriting. "If something happens to me, don't go to the department. Go to the truth." The next pages were covered in cramped writing and ink-smudged maps. Coordinates, photos, water test strips, names, dates, and one phrase that was circled in thick red pen over and over, until the page beneath it had nearly torn. Echo knows. Sarah stared at those two words, her throat tightening. She was on to something, she whispered. Across from her, Tyler, her partner of 4 years, leaned in and squinted at the photos. "This is serious." She was documenting illegal activity, multiple sites. Someone at Halcyon? Sarah nodded, but her voice was tight. She wasn't just documenting, she was building a case. "Look at this, see the water testing kits? That's from behind our own house." Tyler shook his head, worry replacing reason. "Okay, but what do you want to do with this, Sarah? This isn't your fight anymore." She looked at him sharply. "It's our daughter's fight now." "She's 8, he snapped, standing. "And you're putting her in the middle of something that could destroy this family again." Echo, resting at Aria's side, growled low. Aria's eyes never left the notebook. She reached across the table and pointed to a faded Polaroid taped between 2 entries. In it, her mother kneeling beside a creek, Echo beside her, paw lifted mid-step. Behind them, barrels half buried in silt and shadows. "She died for this," Sarah said quietly. "And she didn't want you or Aria dying next," Tyler replied. The air went still. The pages rustled under the ceiling fan. Outside, a bird called shrill and sharp, then fell silent. Tyler sighed and raked a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm not saying we bury it, but we have to be smart. This company Halcyon, they have lawyers, influence, friends on the town council. We go to them with this, they'll twist it." Sarah's voice cracked. "And if we wait? If we do nothing?" "Then we live," Tyler said. "We survive." But even as he said it, his eyes drifted back to the phrase on the page. "Echo knows." It didn't read like a warning. It read like a promise. It began with a yawn that didn't stop. Aria had always been quiet. Withdrawn, yes, but sharp, observant. There was a light behind her eyes that even grief hadn't managed to extinguish. But now, as October painted the windows with amber light, that glow was flickering. At first, Sarah thought it was just stress, or maybe a cold. Aria had been drawing more than usual, curled on the living room rug with Echo beside her, his head resting gently across her feet like a weighted blanket. But then came the second day. Aria didn't finish her breakfast. She barely touched her toast. When Sarah kissed her forehead, it was cold. Not feverish, just off. The third day, she didn't get out of bed at all. And Echo, the ever-alert guardian, didn't try to wake her. He simply laid there, his breathing slow, his ears pinned not in sleep, but in a kind of stillness that set off alarms deep in Sarah's gut. By evening, Aria was pale, her lips tinged with gray. Her little hand, usually warm and strong despite its silence, trembled when Sarah held it. They went straight to Dr. Harlan. The pediatrician's office in Havenbrook hadn't changed in 20 years. Bee decals on the walls, lollipops in a glass jar no one ever remembered to refill. But today, it felt colder, more clinical. Dr. Harlan was a man who believed in Band-Aids, dirt, and children bouncing back. But as he studied Aria, ran his light across her eyes, listened to her heartbeat, his brow furrowed deeper than Sarah had ever seen. "Any recent changes at home?" he asked gently. Sarah hesitated. "You mean emotionally?" "No," he said. "Environmental. New paint, mold, contaminated water source." Sarah froze. Then she remembered the notebook, the maps, the warning. Echo knows. "Maybe," she whispered. Dr. Harlan's gaze sharpened. "Has she been drinking well water?" "Yes," Sarah admitted. "Always has. From the creek behind our house. It runs into our filter system." He didn't need to say anything. He just wrote something down and stood. "I want a blood panel and a toxicity screen just to be safe." As the nurse came in, Aria's eyes followed Sarah. She didn't speak, but her expression was enough an unspoken question that seemed to echo off the sterile walls. "What's happening to me?" Later that night, Sarah sat on the porch swing, the wind creaking the chains like an old lullaby gone sour. The stars hung low, still, watching. Behind her, Echo stepped out from the shadows. She turned to him, and for the first time, she noticed it. He was limping, not much, just a shift in his gait, a hesitation in his step. But it was there, subtle, like a secret trying not to be overheard. He came to her side, leaned into her leg, and exhaled. The sound wasn't tired. It was heavy. She knelt down, running her hands over his coat. The fur felt drier than usual, his nose warm, his eyes rimmed with a redness she hadn't noticed before. He looked up at her, and in that silent, knowing look, she saw the answer that had been whispering beneath every page of Nora's notebook. It wasn't just about the evidence, it was already in them. The storm had passed, but the night still held its breath. Rainwater dripped steadily from the eaves, pooling in silent puddles outside the Bennett farmhouse. The wind had stilled to a whisper, brushing through the wind chimes without sound. Inside, the house was wrapped in darkness. Sarah asleep on the couch, her arm draped protectively over a folder of medical printouts. Upstairs, Aria lay curled in bed, one hand clutching a stuffed bear, the other resting gently on Echo's thick fur. It was the only time they both truly slept together. At 2:17 a.m., the kitchen window cracked, glass scattered across linoleum. A gloved hand reached in, flicked the lock. The back door creaked open. Two shadows stepped inside. They moved like men used to taking what wasn't theirs, silent, methodical. One headed for the basement panel, the other made for the stairs. In the living room, Echo stirred. A low growl bubbled in his throat, quiet, primal, ancient. His ears twitched. His body stiffened. Aria stirred, sensing it, her brow furrowed in her sleep. She whispered in her dream, not a word, but something close. Then came the creak on the stairs. Echo was off the bed in a heartbeat. By the time the second intruder reached the hallway, he was met with a lunging wall of muscle and teeth. "Dog!" the man hissed, stumbling backward. Crack! The taser fired. Echo yelped loud, raw, a sound torn from his ribs. He collapsed hard against the wall, legs twitching. Aria bolted upright, gasping. Her eyes found the man in the hallway, the shadow, the taser, the smoke still rising from Echo's flank. She opened her mouth and screamed, "No!" A single word, ragged, rusty, unused for nearly a year. It shattered the silence. Downstairs, Sarah jerked awake. She dropped the folder. Pages flew like frightened birds. At the same moment, headlights cut through the trees outside. Tires chewed gravel, doors slammed, and then, boom! The back door exploded inward, nearly off its hinges. Elijah Ward stood silhouetted in the frame, shotgun raised, voice like thunder. "Get away from the girl, now!" The man at the stairs turned. "We're not here to hurt." Click. Elijah cocked the shotgun. "Try me." The two intruders ran tripping over themselves as they scrambled back through the window they came in. One limped, the other left behind a dark canvas bag. Elijah didn't follow. He rushed to Echo first. The dog twitched weakly, chest heaving, legs kicking at nothing. Elijah dropped beside him, running his hands across his body, eyes scanning for burns, for wounds. Sarah burst in, wild-eyed. "Aria!" The girl was on the floor, curled beside Echo, sobbing but not silent. She cried out, over and over, "Echo! Echo! Echo!" Sarah fell to her knees, arms wrapping around them both. Outside, a siren in the distance began to wail. Too late. Always too late. Elijah stared at the shattered glass, the broken door, the taser wires. "They weren't just after the notebook," he muttered. "They wanted to erase him." Sarah looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. "We have to tell someone." Elijah's eyes didn't leave the tree line. "We will," he said grimly. "But first, we get him help." He reached for Echo, lifting him gently. The German shepherd groaned, and even in pain, even half-conscious, his eyes found Aria. She whispered again, one word, "Stay." He did. The emergency vet clinic sat like a quiet island in the sea of sirens and asphalt, low-lit, sterile, humming with machines that whispered promises no one believed after midnight. Echo lay on the stainless steel exam table, his side rising in slow, uncertain waves. Aria sat beside him, her tiny hand resting gently on his paw, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. She hadn't spoken again since the scream, but she hadn't let go of Echo once. Dr. Keller, an older woman with crow's feet etched deep from decades of holding grief, lifted the stethoscope from Echo's chest. Her mouth was a firm line. "Elijah," she said quietly, "you need to come with me." In the hallway, under flickering fluorescent light, she pulled off her gloves and didn't sugarcoat it. "He's been poisoned, not tonight, not just once. This has been building for weeks." Elijah's jaw tightened. "You mean accidental exposure?" She shook her head. "No, this is chronic. Exposure to organochlorines. Industrial grade. It mimics autoimmune disorders in dogs. Neurological signs are next." He stared at the floor, then back at her. "Can he survive it?" "If we flush him immediately, yes. But I need you to tell me what kind of chemicals he's been around." Elijah's voice was gravel. "None that I know of." That was the moment Sarah came sprinting down the hallway. "They just called from the pediatrician," she gasped. "Dr. Harlan ran Aria's blood work." She didn't have to finish. Elijah already knew. Inside the exam room, Arya looked up from Echo, her eyes glassy. Sarah crouched beside her, voice trembling. "Baby, the doctor says you've been sick too. That stuff you've been drinking our water, there's something in it." Arya blinked. Her lower lip trembled. She leaned her forehead into Echo's and didn't move. Elijah's mind churned. The symptoms, the notebook, the creek. "The well behind the house," he muttered. "That's where Echo kept going. That's where Nora marked the X." Sarah stood slowly, her face changing from grief to something sharper. Someone did this. To both of them. Elijah's hands curled into fists. And not just them. You don't poison a water line to hurt one dog. You poison it to silence the people who might remember. Dr. Keller re-entered with a clipboard. "I'm reporting this," she said. "But if you have reason to believe this is deliberate contamination, you need to contact the EPA, or the press, or both." Elijah took the clipboard and scrawled his name. "We'll go public," he said. "But we need proof." Sarah looked back through the window. Echo was sleeping now. Hooked to IV fluids. Heart monitor steady. His paw still resting in Arya's lap. "She's already been through too much," Sarah whispered. "She lost her mother. She barely speaks. Now this?" Elijah's eyes didn't leave Arya. And she's still fighting. Just like her mom. In the dim room, Arya opened her notebook again, tiny, shaking fingers beginning to sketch a shape. A map, just like before. The rain had passed, leaving behind a washed-out world where everything felt quieter, like the land was still listening for something it had lost. Arya sat cross-legged on her bed, the glow of her desk lamp casting soft golden halos across the wrinkled pages of the notebook in her lap. Outside, Echo lay curled beside her door, bandaged but alert. Every few minutes his ear twitched at some sound only he could hear. The house no longer felt safe, and maybe it never had. In her hands was Nora's notebook, the leather worn, the spine nearly split. Her mother's handwriting was neat, sharp, like a person always in control of chaos. But tonight, Arya wasn't reading for words. She was reading for feelings. Flipping page by page, she searched for something until she saw it. A page torn at the edge, marked in faint pencil. "The day before I died." Arya froze. The date was circled. A hand-drawn map lay beneath it, rudimentary lines forming the curve of a creek, a bend in the hill, and a dot labeled simply, "Emma's Trail." Her breath hitched. She remembered that name. It was the path her mother used to whisper about, just before bedtime. "Someday, we'll bring Echo there again. Just you, me, and the wind." Emma's Trail wasn't on any public map. It wasn't a real hiking trail. It was a nickname, the secret path Nora had carved when Arya was still too small to walk the whole way on her own. The place where they buried time capsules made from peanut butter jars. The place where Echo learned to chase shadows without barking. The last place they ever walked together. A memory drifted up like smoke. Arya, maybe 6, wearing yellow boots too big for her, trudging through cattails while Nora held her hand, and Echo nudged her from behind, gently hurting. Her mother had whispered, "This place is just for us. If something ever happens, follow Echo. He remembers." She hadn't thought of it since. But now it felt like everything pointed there. She reached for her own spiral-bound notebook, the one she always carried but rarely showed. Flipping past old sketches of trees and water droplets and dog paws, she opened to a blank page and began to draw. Her pencil scratched the paper in slow, deliberate strokes. She drew the old fence behind the barn, the winding footpath near the hollow log, the rock shaped like a broken heart. Mom had called it that. And then the big tree with roots like fingers stretching into the water. Echo lifted his head, ears perking. He crawled closer and nudged the notebook with his nose. His tail thumped once, then twice. Aria smiled for the first time in days. This wasn't just a drawing, it was a map of memory, and Echo, he still remembered. She circled the last part of her sketch and wrote in careful block letters, Emma's Trail. Start here. Downstairs, Sarah argued with Tyler in hushed tones, unaware of the map unfolding upstairs, unaware that a silent girl and a dog who'd almost died were already retracing a story the adults had buried. They didn't speak her name in public, not at first, but the stories started to spread. At the bakery on Main Street, behind the clatter of mixing bowls and the warmth of rising dough, Mrs. Heller whispered to a customer, "You heard about the Bennett girl? The dog chose her." Right in front of Marcus Vane. At the gas station, a mechanic named Bo rubbed his hands on an oil-stained rag and muttered, "Elijah Ward stepped in. I ain't seen him since the refinery fire. That man don't show up unless it's serious." And at the post office, someone pinned a printed photo of Aria and Echo taken at the fairgrounds, grainy and overexposed. Someone else scribbled on the bottom in red ink, "Some dogs follow orders, some follow truth." By the end of the week, the town had begun to stir. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into quiet anger. Anger into something even more powerful purpose. They remembered things, like how Halcyon had built its third plant near a protected waterway, how the town council mysteriously approved the permit after a closed session, how Officer Nora Bennett had warned them months before she died and no one had listened. Now they looked at her daughter, a girl who hadn't spoken in almost a year, a girl who showed up at an auction with a jar of coins and walked away with a retired K-9 who refused to leave her side. And somehow it felt like everything was connected. Elijah Ward sat alone on the back porch of his ranch house that evening, a fire crackling in the pit beside him, its glow dancing across the brim of his weathered hat. The sun had dipped low, setting the clouds on fire in hues of tangerine and blood orange. He lit a cigarette but didn't smoke it, just let it burn. His phone buzzed. A name flashed across the screen. Chief Daniels, return. He answered with a gravelly, "Yeah." The voice on the other end was hoarse, but steady. "Heard you stirred something up, Eli." Elijah let out a dry chuckle. "Didn't mean to, just showed up." "That girl, she yours?" "No, but she should have been someone's." There was a silence that said everything. By the time Elijah hung up, he'd heard from two other old friends, a firefighter named Reggie, who once saved Echo from a structure collapse, and a combat vet named May Alvarez, who ran a kennel outside of town. They all said the same thing: "Whatever you need." The next day, Aria walked into town with Echo. No hand to hold, no mother's voice to steady her. Just the sound of the dog's footsteps beside her, steady and loyal. He didn't need a leash anymore. He matched her every step like they'd trained together for years. People stared, not in judgment, but in quiet recognition. A child who didn't speak, a dog who wouldn't leave her side, and together they looked like the start of something bigger. Outside the town hall, someone taped a flyer to the glass. "Emergency council meeting, water safety, environmental disputes, public testimonies. This Friday, 6 p.m. By noon, every copy machine in Havenbrook was out of paper. The doors of Havenbrook Town Hall had never seen such a crowd. By 5 o'clock, the benches were full. By 5:15, people were lining the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder in the back, spilling out into the lobby. Children perched on their parents' laps. Reporters unpacked tripods and checked sound levels. Someone handed out water bottles from a cooler marked, "For Truth." At the front of the hall, 7 council members sat stiffly behind polished oak. Their nameplates gleamed, but not as much as the sweat on their brows. Aria Bennett sat in the front row, legs swinging, her fingers buried in the fur of the dog pressed against her side. Echo, no longer just a retired canine, now wore a blue vest with a silver patch. Certified therapy dog. Duty continues. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just watched the chamber quiet, alert, a sentinel in fur. When the gavel finally fell, the room hushed so quickly it felt like the air had been vacuumed out. "First on the agenda," the chairman announced, clearing his throat, "a motion filed by residents of Havenbrook requesting emergency review of environmental safety and public health concerns regarding Halcyon Industries." Whispers rippled. Then Sarah Bennett stood. Nora's sister, Aria's aunt. A woman whose voice had cracked every time she tried to speak of what happened. But not tonight. She stepped to the microphone, holding a thick folder to her chest. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "These are Aria's lab results," she said, "from last week. Chronic fatigue, nausea, elevated levels of benzene and toluene. Both are Class 1 industrial pollutants." She opened the folder, placing it on the table beside the mic with care, like she was laying down a child. "Echo," she said, nodding toward the dog, "has tested positive for the same chemical markers. He's not just a witness. He's another victim." Someone in the crowd gasped. Sarah continued, her voice catching only once. "My sister officer, Nora Bennett, died trying to expose what's poisoning this town. She didn't just die in the line of duty. She died because someone decided money mattered more than children." In the back, a man in flannel rose. "Name's Mike Greer," he said, walking forward. "Former city accountant." He pulled a USB drive from his pocket and held it up. "This right here? It shows over $400,000 in unaccounted municipal disbursements. Councilman Langley, Reeves, and Durant all received consulting stipends from shell companies tied to Halcyon's expansion division." The chamber erupted shouts, gasps, murmurs of, "How long?" and "I knew it." Mike set the drive on the clerk's desk like a judge's gavel. "Do the math," he said. "Then look these people in the eye and tell them their sickness was a coincidence." The chairman slammed his gavel. "Order! Order!" But the room wouldn't go still. Not until Echo stood. He rose slowly beside Aria, gaze sweeping the chamber like he could see through every lie, every bribe, every excuse. His tail didn't wag, his head didn't tilt. He just stared until even the murmurs stopped. And in that silence, Aria reached into her backpack. She pulled out a hand-drawn map crayon lines, crooked stars, red X's, blue squiggles labeled creek, mom's chair, bad smell place. She held it up. No words, just her eyes. And every person in that hall knew what she was saying. This is where it started. The map in Aria's hands trembled, but her eyes never did. She stepped forward, quiet, small, a child in a sea of adults, but somehow the center of it all. The fluorescent lights of Havenbrook Town Hall flickered above her as she laid the crayon-marked map on the hearing table. Red X's marked strange curves in the river, Circles traced familiar trails. One spot was labeled in shaky pencil, "Where she cried." Echo sat behind her like a stone guardian, eyes fixed forward. "Is that hand-drawn?" one councilman asked, squinting. Sarah nodded. "By Aria, but based on routes her mother took Echo on. Locations Nora marked in her own notebook. Places they visited the week before her death." Gasps murmured around the chamber. Councilman Reeves adjusted his tie, suddenly pale. Mike stepped in again. "We verified several of the points Aria mapped against archived municipal records and wildlife monitoring reports. You know what we found? Spikes in chemical levels within 20 feet of nearly every X. These aren't drawings. These are evidence." Councilman Langley shifted uneasily. "But a child's map." "Sometimes a child sees what grown men ignore," Elijah interrupted from the aisle. Suddenly, a sharp growl tore through the silence. Echo's ears pinned back, his shoulders squared, but the sound hadn't come from him. It came from Max Elijah's service dog, now standing in the back of the room. The big shepherd had been silent all evening, resting near Elijah's feet. Until now. His body was rigid, teeth exposed. His nose pointed to Marcus Vane, more specifically, to the black leather briefcase at his side. Marcus leaned down, attempting to calm the dog. "Get that animal away from me." But Max growled louder. Elijah's voice rang clear. "He doesn't growl unless there's a reason." Officer Grady approached cautiously, hand on his belt. "Mr. Vane, may we inspect the briefcase?" Marcus clutched it tighter. "Absolutely not. That's confidential work material." The room shifted. Echo was now on his feet too, low rumble in his chest. A mirror of Max. Councilman Durant tried to interject, "This is absurd." "Then open it," Sarah said coldly. "If you've got nothing to hide." Grady nodded. "Mr. Vane, I'm asking respectfully." For a moment, time seemed to pause, until Marcus hissed, "Fine," and slid the case forward. Grady opened it slowly. At first nothing. A laptop, folders, then beneath the lining something metallic. He reached in and pulled out a small device, blinking red. "What is that?" a reporter called. Mike stepped forward, face darkening. "That's a signal jammer. And next to it—" Grady pulled out a second object, smaller, sleek, with a pinhole lens. "A surveillance bug," he said. The room exploded. "Is that legal?" "They've been listening." "For how long?" Marcus stood, straightening his jacket. "This meeting is over." But before he could take a step, Grady blocked him. "You're not leaving with that device." "Are you accusing me of espionage?" "No," Sarah said. "We're accusing you of murder by silence." As the council members shouted and the press surged forward, Aria didn't move. She simply stared at Marcus, then looked down at Echo, who was watching her. She reached into her backpack again and pulled out a second map, one that wasn't drawn by crayon, but by her mother. At the top, in Nora Bennett's handwriting, "If anything happens to me, Echo knows where to look." She placed it beside her own. 2 maps, 1 legacy. The trail narrowed as it climbed, winding like a secret that had waited too long to be told. Fallen pine needles muted every step. Elijah led, boots crunching softly. Mike followed, holding a GPS scanner synced to Aria's hand-drawn map. Behind them, Aria moved quietly beside Echo, who padded forward like he'd been here 100 times before. They reached the overlook by midday, a jagged shelf of granite that jutted out above Havenbrook Creek. The wind up here was different, harsher, lonelier. "This is where she brought me," Aria whispered. "On Sundays. Just her and Echo." A gust stirred her hair. She pointed toward an old birch, its trunk split at the base. "That's where we sat." Elijah narrowed his eyes, scanning the tree line. Then he saw it. A birdhouse, perched unnaturally high. Too high for children to reach, too perfect in its symmetry to be built for birds. "Mike," he said quietly, "bring the ladder." Mike climbed up, fingers careful as they opened the wooden shell. Inside, buried behind a thin mesh of camouflage netting, a wildlife camera. Its red light was long dead, but its card slot was full. Back at the firehouse command post, the room was silent but for the low hum of a laptop. Mike inserted the SD card. The footage began grainy, time-stamped from almost a year ago. At first, just static trees, a hawk passing, then voices. "You think you can scare me off my own investigation?" The camera shifted with a gust of wind, but the mic caught the voice sharp. Controlled. Nora Bennett. "Nora, listen, this doesn't have to go further than it already has." Another voice, male, gravelly. "James Merritt." Mike leaned forward. "Freeze it. Enhance." The blurry figure came into view, square-shouldered, broad, wearing tactical boots. Merritt. Nora's face turned, partially visible in profile. She was holding a folder, papers fluttering. "Tell Marcus I won't stop. I've already made copies." "I know you have. That's why this is unfortunate." There was a struggle. Nora backed up. Merritt lunged. The camera didn't show the exact moment, but her scream rang out like a bell through the forest, then silence. Leaves blew. A crow cawed. An echo smaller then came into view. He sniffed the folder, sat beside it. Didn't leave. Sarah covered her mouth, tears streaming. "That fall," she whispered. "It wasn't—" "No." Elijah's jaw tightened. "It wasn't an accident. She was pushed." Mike uploaded the video to a secure drive. "This is enough to issue a warrant." Aria, silent through it all, walked over and placed her hand on Echo's back. He leaned into her gently, as if remembering. The birdhouse camera hadn't just captured a crime. It had kept a promise. The metal door slammed shut behind James Merritt with a hollow clang that echoed down the concrete hallway. He didn't speak, didn't lift his eyes. 2 guards walked him into interview room 3. No cuffs. Just the weight of truth he could no longer outrun. Elijah leaned against the one-way mirror, arms crossed. Across the glass, Merritt sat hunched at the steel table, his hands trembling more from shame than fear. Detective Alton Grady entered, slow and measured. He laid a folder on the table and opened it without a word. Inside, printed stills from the wildlife cam. Nora mid-sentence, Merritt's hand reaching. The moment before, everything changed. Grady didn't speak for 47 seconds, just let the silence fill the cracks Merritt was trying to hold together. Then, "We know it was you." Merritt blinked, swallowed. "I never meant to push her. It got out of hand." Grady leaned in. "What exactly got out of hand, Merritt?" His voice cracked. "Victor. Victor told me to convince her to stop digging, to bring back the dog." "The dog?" Grady's tone turned sharp. "Echo. He said the damn mutt had seen too much, heard things Nora wasn't supposed to." Across the mirror, Elijah exhaled, slow and bitter. Sarah sat in the next room, hand over Aria's ears despite the soundproof glass. She knew what was coming wouldn't be gentle. Back in the room, Merritt broke. He gave the order. Victor Coleman. Said it was clean up. Said the council would back him no matter what happened. That she was a threat. He looked up finally. I didn't mean to kill her. I grabbed her arm. She slipped. I thought she'd land lower, but she didn't, Grady finished coldly. No, Merritt whispered. She didn't. Outside, Echo let out a low whine from his seat next to Aria. He had been there that day. He'd tried to lead someone to the truth before he even had the words for it. And now, after all the silence, the truth finally spoke back. In the district prosecutor's office 2 hours later, Grady recorded Merritt's formal deposition. Victor Coleman was named clearly and repeatedly. Echo was described as a witness, the only one who had stayed by Nora's side after the fall. Merritt's last words in the statement? I was supposed to get rid of the dog, but when I found him, he looked at me like he already knew. The sun broke through the clouds with the kind of golden defiance that made Haven Brook's courthouse dome gleam like justice finally meant something. News vans lined the street, microphones jutted like weapons, cameramen whispered into headsets as the crowd buzzed. Victor Coleman exited the marble steps with the confidence of a man who'd never been touched by consequences. Navy blazer, polished shoes, a practiced smirk that had survived 3 mayoral campaigns and decades of secrets. But today, someone had flipped the script. 2 U.S. Marshals in dark suits flanked him, moving fast. Click, flash, shouts erupted. Mr. Coleman, are the charges true? Did you order the murder of Officer Bennett? Is Halcyon behind the water contamination? Victor turned, but not to the cameras. He turned toward the sidewalk and locked eyes with an 8-year-old girl. Aria stood still in her yellow raincoat, too big for her, clutching Echo's leash with quiet strength. The German shepherd growled low, not a warning, not a threat, a memory, a promise. Victor's smile didn't falter, but something behind his eyes went colder. You think this ends now, he said, his voice like gravel behind velvet. Children forget, but power doesn't. The crowd stilled, the press missed it, but Aria heard every word. So did Echo. The marshals shoved Victor forward. He didn't resist, but he didn't stop smiling either. Sarah knelt beside her daughter, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. He can't hurt us anymore, she whispered. Aria didn't speak. She didn't need to. She looked down at the notebook in her hand, Nora's last sketches, Nora's words, Nora's map. And she looked up at Echo. His eyes, always steady, always waiting, met hers like they had 1,000 times before. But this time something had shifted. There was no fear left in them, no uncertainty, only the quiet understanding of a promise kept. He licked her hand, once, gently, the way he always did after a nightmare, as if to say, I'm here. You're safe, but we're not done yet. The courtroom behind them buzzed with reporters, flashing cameras, and the clatter of chairs scraping back as people stood in disbelief at what had just unfolded. But for Aria, none of it mattered. Not the headlines, not the verdict, not the words of men in suits who'd once tried to silence her. What mattered was Echo. His presence beside her, solid, scarred, unwavering, was louder than any gavel strike. They both knew. There were still names left unspoken, still trails to uncover, still truths buried beneath poisoned ground and broken trust. But they also knew this. This wasn't the end. It was the turning point. The moment the story stopped being about what they lost and became about what they were willing to fight for, together. The girl who had once stopped speaking, and the dog who had never needed words. The wind whispered low through the trees like a voice remembering. Aria stood at the edge of the trail, her rain boots dusted with pine needles, her fingers clutching the notebook worn soft at the corners. Echo stood beside her, still, alert, tail barely moving. Behind them, Sarah and Elijah paused at the crest of the hill, staring at the gnarled oak ahead. It rose like a monument from the forest floor, its trunk split clean down the center by a bolt of lightning long ago. The wound had blackened with age, but its roots held steady, half submerged in moss, half clinging to fractured stone. The bark curled like cauterized skin. This was the place Nora had marked with a shaky red X. Elijah stepped forward first. His boots crunched the dry leaves. "She used to come here after shifts," he murmured. "Said it helped her think straight. Said Echo always found his way back here even when she didn't give the command." Echo stepped ahead. No leash, no voice, just instinct. He nosed along the base of the tree, sniffing the air like it held memories. Then he stopped and began to dig. Slow, at first one paw, then the other. Then faster, more frantic. Aria watched, breath hitched in her chest. She dropped to her knees beside him, brushing aside loose soil with her bare hands, cold and trembling, and then clink. Glass. Echo stopped. Aria lifted the object slowly. A mason jar, sealed with duct tape, clouded by dirt, but intact. Inside, vials, samples, labels in Nora's handwriting, smudged but legible. Creekbed April, storm runoff May, halcyon perimeter fence. Elijah exhaled sharply. She knew it was bad, but she documented everything. Sarah stepped closer, wiping the jar clean with the edge of her sleeve. This could have gotten her killed. Aria didn't answer. She reached back into the shallow hole where Echo had paused and pulled out a second item, a folded Ziploc bag. Inside, a sealed envelope, brittle with age. On the front, in faded ink, "If they find me first, this is where it begins." The silence between them stretched. The trees leaned in as if listening. Elijah finally broke it. "We bring this to the EPA. Now." Sarah's eyes moved to Aria. "Not yet. Let her have a moment." Aria sat back on her heels, the jar in her lap, the envelope pressed to her chest. Echo rested his head against her side. Not a guard dog now, just a witness. The creek murmured in the background, and above them the sun broke through, setting the broken oak aglow. Where the river split, truth had taken root, and a mother's final mission was finally seen. The paper was thin, brittle, and carried the scent of rain and time. Sarah turned each page of Nora's notebook like unwrapping a memory too delicate to touch. They sat on the back porch in silence, Elijah watching the woods, Aria curled beside Echo with her chin on his shoulder. Dusk fell slow across the Bennett house, tinting everything gold, then ash. Sarah read aloud, her voice tight. "Day 3 without a call back from Grady. Something's off. The creek samples from Halcyon's southern line came back worse than I feared. Illegally high levels of hexavalent chromium enough to cause cancer. I logged it, sent copies to environmental control. Nothing. No reply, no escalation." Another page. "Day 5, I saw Marcus Vane outside the lab. He shouldn't have access. He smiled when he left, like he knew I saw him. I told Captain Rhodes. He told me to drop it. Said the water board had higher priorities. I don't think they'll protect me. I don't think anyone will." The words bled with urgency, but there were no signs of panic, just clarity. Nora had written not as someone afraid for herself, but for someone more important. Then came the final page, a letter, folded carefully, taped into the back of the notebook. "If this is ever found—" Sarah's hand shook slightly as she unfolded it. Elijah leaned closer. "Aria, my love, if you're reading this, it means I didn't come home. I don't know what they'll say, what they'll call it. An accident, maybe. A misstep. But it wasn't. It won't be. I tried to follow the trail, and I found rot. Not just in Halcyon, but in the very people I trusted to protect this place. People I trained beside. People I broke bread with. And I don't know who to trust anymore. So I'm giving the last piece to someone who's never failed me." Sarah looked up. Echo was still beside Aria, eyes closed but ears twitching with every word. "Echo knows what I've seen. He knows where I've been. He remembers everything, and he remembers you. He's not just a K9. He's my partner. And now he's yours." There was a smudge, then a final line, handwritten in haste across the bottom of the page. "Protect her." Sarah's voice cracked. Elijah looked away. Aria, still silent, leaned into Echo, her small hand gripping the tag that hung from his collar. The porch light flicked on. The wind shifted, and somewhere in that fragile space between past and present, a mother's final whisper echoed not in words, but in the steady heartbeat of a dog who never forgot his last command. The tree stood on the south ridge, not far from the school playground, overlooking the bend where the river curved like a soft question mark against the horizon. It wasn't grand, it wasn't even tall, but it was the kind Nora would have picked. Sturdy, local, quiet in its beauty. A sugar maple, just old enough to cast a shadow by late afternoon. It had been planted where the town could see it grow, where her name could take root, not in a statue of stone, but in something alive. The plaque read simply, "In memory of Officer Nora Bennett Protector, Mother Truth Teller." The town came in clusters, some in uniforms, some with soil still on their hands from the morning's work. The fire chief gave a few words. So did Officer Grady. Even Councilman Ruiz, voice hoarse, spoke of integrity, of failure, of doing better. But no one spoke louder than the silence that followed. Because it was Aria who stepped forward next. She wore her rain boots and a worn backpack. Echo walked beside her without leash or command, just as he always had with Nora. They moved slowly toward the tree, past the folding chairs and murmurs, past the cameras and eyes. And at the base of the maple, Aria knelt. She took out a folded sheet of drawing paper. Carefully, she smoothed it across the soil. The wind caught the edges, but she weighed it down with a river stone flat, round, from the same creek bed where Echo had once dug. The drawing was simple. A winding trail, a creek, a girl, a dog, and above them, a figure drawn in soft pencil lines, watching, smiling. At the bottom, scrawled in purple crayon, "We followed your map, Mom." No one moved. No one breathed. Echo sat beside her and raised his eyes to the tree as if he too understood. Elijah placed a hand on Sarah's back. Sarah pressed a tissue to her mouth, failing to stop the tears. There was no trumpet, no gun salute, but the wind moved through the leaves above like a voice, and in that whispering hush, the town understood something unspoken that sometimes the bravest people don't wear capes. They carry clipboards, kiss their daughters goodbye, and plant clues for the truth when no one else dares to. That a girl who hadn't spoken in a year could draw something more powerful than any speech. Her hands had trembled at first. Clumsy lines, smudged colors, but each stroke carried a memory, a place, a promise. She didn't need applause. She didn't need a microphone. She had her notebook, her colors, and her truth. And when the town gathered beneath the memorial tree, it wasn't the speeches or plaques that held them still. It was the drawing, taped at the base of the trunk. A trail of symbols only a mother and daughter would understand. A house, a badge, a creek, a paw print, a message in childlike scrawl. "We followed your map, Mom." And that a dog just one could carry the last wish of the fallen all the way home. Echo hadn't needed to speak either. He had remembered every path, every sound, every whispered command from the woman who once knelt beside him with tired eyes and steady hands. He had waited, watched, protected. And in the end, when the world finally listened, it wasn't because he barked. It was because he stayed, when everyone else had walked away. The auditorium at Havenbrook Civic Center had never seen a crowd like this. Reporters pressed along the back walls. State troopers lined the aisle. The mayor stood stiffly beside a polished podium. And front and center, beneath a blue velvet banner bearing the seal of the state of New Arden, sat a single chair, reserved not for a person, but for a dog. Echo sat tall, alert but calm, the silver gray of age soft around his muzzle. His badge, polished and reattached to his retired harness, caught the light like a star on his chest. To his left, Aria, in a dark blue dress with tiny silver buttons, sat holding a small bouquet of forget-me-nots. Her hand never left Echo's fur. To his right, Sarah, standing straight in her uniform, eyes filled with something that hovered between pride and grief, and behind them, quietly watching it all, Elijah, arms crossed, hat in hand. The mayor cleared his throat. This day marks the first time in our state's history that a retired K-9 has been awarded the service commendation for post-duty testimony, he began. But what Echo did, what this team did, goes beyond precedent. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Echo not only helped expose illegal industrial dumping, he also preserved the memory, the movement, the truth of Officer Nora Bennett. Long after her voice was silenced, her partner still spoke, through action, through memory, through loyalty. He turned to Echo. "You are not just a dog. You are a witness, a protector, a hero." The audience stood as a medal specially forged, engraved with Echo's name, was placed gently around his neck. Cameras flashed, applause thundered, but Echo didn't move. His eyes stayed steady on Aria. She blinked up at him, wide-eyed. And then her voice came, quiet, raspy, but clear. "He saved me," she whispered into the microphone. Just like she said. Gasps, and then silence. The words were raw and real. The first full sentence she had spoken in public since her mother died. It was enough to still every camera, hush every cough, even bring the mayor's scripted notes to a trembling halt. A beat passed, then another, and then the applause returned. Not loud this time, but deep, like thunder just beneath the earth. Echo turned to Aria and leaned his head into her shoulder. And for that moment, the world felt whole again. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had been honored properly, publicly, and with love. Healing didn't come in a single moment. It came in fragments, like sunlight breaking through a thick canopy, one flicker at a time. In the weeks after the ceremony, Havenbrook grew quieter, but not in the same way. It wasn't silence born of fear or grief anymore. It was a pause, the kind people made when listening, when remembering. At home, the nights were different now. Arya no longer tossed and turned. Echo had taken to sleeping not at the foot of her bed, but right alongside it, his back pressed gently to hers, as if tethering her to sleep. Some nights, he'd twitch in his dreams' legs, paddling gently as if still chasing ghosts. But if Arya stirred, he'd press his head to her arm until she calmed. They were learning to breathe in the same rhythm again. In the daylight hours, Arya attended her sessions with Dr. Lindstrom, the child therapist Sarah had known from Nora's department days. The office was lined with books and soft animal puppets, but Arya didn't touch them. Instead, she sketched. Always maps, trails, Echo's footprints. "Why maps?" the doctor had asked once. Arya had blinked, then scribbled something on the edge of the paper. "Because they show you where you got lost, and where you can go next." And slowly, one word at a time, her voice returned. Not always in full sentences, not always loudly, but with intent, with honesty, with something no one could teach her but grief. And somewhere along the way, her voice stopped trembling. Across town, Sarah stood on a makeshift platform in the town square, speaking to a gathering of school children and their parents. A large printed sign behind her read, "Safe Water, Safe Future." She held up two photos, one of a chemical barrel unearthed near the riverbank, the other of Arya's blood work. And then she told them the story, not as a cop, not as a widow, but as a mother. "When we stay silent," she said, "we let the danger stay buried. And when we speak up, even when it hurts, we start digging it out for our children, for our towns, for what's right." Applause rose modest but meaningful. Echo sat beside the stage, wearing a harness marked "Therapy Dog." He blinked slowly at the kids who came up after, gently letting them pet his fur, even the nervous ones. One boy, no older than 5, hugged him and whispered, "Thank you for making the girl talk again." Echo licked the boy's cheek, and in that moment, the weight of tragedy didn't vanish, but it shifted, became a foundation, a place to rebuild from, because healing isn't quiet. It's messy, loud, full of stops and starts, but it shows up in the tremble of a first sentence, in a mother's trembling voice at a microphone, in a dog refusing to sleep anywhere else but beside the girl who never gave up. They said Marcus Vane had gone quiet, but quiet wasn't the same as gone. In a holding cell 2 counties overhidden beneath the noise of transfers, court dates, and press coverage, Victor Coleman sat behind bulletproof glass, leaning into a visitor whose badge didn't match the name on the log. The exchange lasted 43 seconds, just enough for a nod, just enough for an envelope. No one noticed the slip of paper passed beneath the table. No one saw the guard turn his back. But in the shadows of Havenbrook, consequences were already in motion. At 6:17 the next morning, a call came in from the county detention center. Inmate Merritt was attacked in the infirmary, blunt force trauma. He's in critical condition. Sarah dropped her coffee. Elijah, standing beside her, didn't speak, but his jaw clenched so tight his teeth creaked. "They're silencing him," he muttered, "before he can testify in full." By midday, the preliminary hearing was postponed. Witness incapacitated. Evidence pending. And then came the second blow. Mike burst through the door of Sarah's office, breathless. "The backup Nora gave me, the USB drive, it's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "I kept it in the lockbox behind the false panel. Same place we stored the photos. Everything else is still there, except the drive." The room fell into stunned silence. Echo, lying near the doorway, lifted his head and let out a low growl as if sensing what they hadn't yet said aloud. The leak wasn't plugged. Someone still had reach. Someone still had access. Sarah ran a hand over her face. The USB had more than photos. It had names, shipment records, a confession draft she never got to file. "And if that gets buried," Elijah added, "we lose our only shot at convicting Victor permanently." They didn't need to ask who had orchestrated it. Marcus Vane may have been behind bars, but his reach was longer than steel bars and courtroom dates. And he wasn't done. Prisons, for men like Marcus, were temporary inconveniences, mere speed bumps on a road paved with influence, silence, and favors owed. While the world outside celebrated justice, Marcus sat in a federal holding cell not with regret, but with strategy. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he waited. Because he knew something the others hadn't considered yet. Not all loose ends wear uniforms. The guard who nodded too long at shift change, the paralegal with a sealed envelope, never entered into evidence. The man on the outside, who owed him a life. And most of all, the missing USB Nora had labeled fail-safe. He knew it hadn't been fully decoded, and as long as it remained hidden or corrupted, there was still time. Still shadow to operate in. So when the attack on Merritt came, it wasn't loud, it wasn't messy, it was precise, intentional. And it sent a message loud enough to reach even the quietest corners of Havenbrook. "You think this ends now?" He had whispered it on the courthouse steps, and now, with a smirk in the dark, Marcus Vane prepared to finish what he started. From the inside out. It began with a nose twitch. Echo had been quiet since the news about Merritt's attack, restless, alert, as if something inside him had shifted. Not fear, not aggression, but purpose. As if gears were turning behind those amber eyes. That morning, while Sarah and Elijah pored over documents and damage control plans, Aria sat on the floor of her room, thumbing through her old school things. She hadn't touched the backpack in almost a year. It still smelled like crayon wax and forgotten pencils. Echo padded in without a sound. He sat in front of the backpack and stared. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pressed his nose against the front pocket. Not once. Not twice. 3 times. A message. Aria blinked. "What, boy?" He nudged the zipper with his snout. She opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, crinkled, almost translucent from time. A child's drawing hers from last fall. She recognized the style immediately. Trees drawn with green swirls. A figure labeled Mom standing beside E with a little police badge. But at the bottom corner were 4 strange marks, not random scribbles, symbols, the same ones Nora used in her notebook maps. Aria felt the breath leave her lungs. She ran downstairs, paper clutched in hand. "Mom, look!" Sarah took one glance at the page and froze. "Where did you get this?" "My backpack," Aria said. "Echo found it." Elijah leaned closer. Those symbols. Nora used them when she didn't trust plain text. They were directional codes, markers, a breadcrumb trail. An hour later, the 3 of them stood in the attic. It was the last place anyone wanted to be in midsummer, stifling and dusty, but Echo was already up the ladder, waiting. He pawed at a narrow beam behind the insulation, whining softly. Elijah pulled back a panel of dry wood. Hidden beneath a layer of yellowing newspaper was a small cloth pouch. Inside, wrapped in layers of gauze, was a USB drive, labeled in Nora's careful, looping handwriting. "Fail safe." Sarah held it in her palm as if it might break from touch. "She knew they'd try something," she whispered. "She didn't just plan for backup. She planned for betrayal." Echo whined again, not out of pain, but release. He had remembered. He had led them here. And once again, it wasn't words that saved the truth. It was trust. The USB drive clicked into place with a faint chime. Sarah's hands trembled as the screen blinked to life. Elijah stood behind her, arms crossed tightly, his jaw set like stone. Aria sat on the couch with Echo's head resting in her lap, her fingers curled into the fur behind his ears, where she always felt safest. The folder on the drive was labeled in all caps, "To whom it may concern, eyes only." Inside, 5 files, 4 video, 1 document. Sarah clicked the first. Grainy black and white footage filled the screen. Surveillance cam. The timestamp showed 2:13 a.m. Nora's handwriting labeled the clip, "Loading Dock 9, Halcyon East." In the shadows, a man unloading blue barrels into an unmarked van. His face wasn't visible, but his voice was. Marcus Vane. "Keep your mouth shut, and you'll get your bonus. This is clean. No tags. No oversight." The next clip showed 2 councilmen accepting a briefcase, each money, in exchange for silence. The third was audio only. Nora's voice calm, precise, and exhausted. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone. And if I'm gone, it wasn't an accident." Sarah pressed pause. No one spoke. Then Elijah stepped forward and opened the 4th file, a scanned letter in Nora's handwriting, dated 3 days before her death. "Elijah, if you find this, I trust you'll finish what I started. I know who's behind it all. But I can't take them on alone. Echo knows more than anyone realizes. Follow him. I've marked the routes. Trust no one except Sarah. And don't let Aria near the creek without filtration halcyons dumping upstream. This isn't just about money. It's about power. And they're willing to erase anyone who sees too much. Finish it. For her." Nora. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah swallowed back a sob. "She knew," Elijah whispered. "All of it." 2 hours later, Elijah stepped out of a government sedan at the federal field office just outside Havenbrook. He carried the USB drive in a weathered envelope, Nora's name still visible beneath a smudge of attic dust. Special Agent Leah Collins met him at the door. "We've been watching Halcyon for a while," she said, "but this changes everything." He handed her the envelope without a word. "This evidence, it's not just admissible," she added, scanning the label. "It's explosive." Back at the house, Sarah held Aria tightly, her lips against her daughter's hair. Echo sat by the window. He didn't sleep, not yet. Because somewhere out there the storm Nora tried to outrun was finally being named. And for the first time in almost a year, justice wasn't just a word. It was coming. The courtroom was packed, not with strangers, but with neighbors. People who had shared sidewalks and Sunday markets, who'd once nodded politely at council meetings and never asked where the water lines ran. But now they came armed with questions, grief, and an ache for truth. A hush fell as the judge entered. On the prosecution's table sat a box of files, each stamped evidence, federal subpoena. Across the aisle, 3 councilmen, Donahue, Simmons, and Grant sat, stiff in tailored suits. But the Polish couldn't hide the sweat. Each had denied involvement for months. Each had accepted money from Halcyon. Each had voted against investigating the creek. And now each stood indicted for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and knowingly endangering public health. When the charges were read aloud, a slow wave of gasps moved through the room. But no one cried harder than Sarah, not out of fear, out of relief. That afternoon, in the center of Havenbrook Square, an announcement echoed from the old courthouse steps. Effective immediately, the Environmental Protection Agency, in conjunction with state and local officials, has launched a full-scale toxicology remediation and groundwater cleanup of affected sites. All costs will be levied against Halcyon Corporation and its associates pending federal seizure. The crowd erupted. On the gazebo, the mayor's voice shook slightly. "Some stories of courage," she said, "don't begin with heroes. They begin with grief." She turned to the small girl in a denim jacket standing silently near the podium. She didn't march. She didn't shout. She simply followed what she loved. And because of that, truth came to light. She bent down and pinned a medal-shaped badge to Aria's collar. "Aria Bennett, by the will of this town council and its citizens, you are hereby named Honorary Citizen of Havenbrook." There was no applause at first, only stillness, until Echo, sitting beside her, gave one proud bark. And then the clapping came, from every direction. People who hadn't agreed on a vote in decades now stood as one, cheering not just for a child, but for the silence she broke, the truth she carried, and the dog who never stopped protecting her. That night, under a sky clearer than any they remembered in months, Aria stood beside the tree they'd planted for Nora. She traced her fingers over the wooden sign that read, "In memory of Officer Nora Bennett." She followed the map. Echo lay at her feet. His chest rose and fell in quiet rhythm, ears twitching slightly at the sound of leaves brushing the window pane. He wasn't asleep, not fully. He was listening, like always, guarding, even in rest. She didn't need to speak. Not tonight. Not when every word had already been written between the lines of her drawings, carved into the paths she and Echo had walked, and echoed in the silence that had once kept her caged. Now, that silence was hers to command. A choice, not a prison. The whole town had heard her story now. But they hadn't just heard it. They had felt it. In the courtroom tension, in the tear-stained council chambers, in the bark that broke protocol, in the little girl who stood without words and still said everything that mattered. She had stitched together the fragments her mother left behind, and with Echo by her side, made them whole. And it was only the beginning, because justice wasn't a finish line. It was roots being planted, water being tested, voices being reclaimed, and a girl with soft eyes and a German shepherd at her heel was just getting started. The first chill of autumn drifted over Havenbrook like a whisper, cool, gentle, and clean. For the first time in years, the creek didn't reek of iron or rot. It shimmered in the morning sun, winding through the woods like a silver ribbon, cradling the memory of a town that had almost forgotten how to heal. And there, just beside its curve, stood a little girl with dirt under her nails and hope in her hands. Aria Bennett knelt in the soft, overturned soil, her denim jacket sleeves rolled up. She patted the base of the young red oak sapling with quiet care, as if tucking in a sleeping child. Beside her, Echo rested in the grass, tail flicking lazily, ears alert but calm. A breeze rustled his fur, and for a moment he looked like part of the earth itself, worn, rooted, watchful. Sarah stood a few feet away with Elijah, surrounded by others who had come to witness the reforesting effort. Students, local firefighters, Dr. Harlan, Tyler, even a few council members, newly elected ones. The poisoned land had once been choked by barrels and lies. Now it bore saplings in straight, determined rows, one tree, one truth, one root at a time. A small wooden podium had been set up by the edge of the clearing. The mayor called Aria forward, gently, not with pomp or pressure, but with the kind of voice reserved for someone who'd earned her silence and her voice. Aria hesitated. Then her hand found Echo's neck. The dog stood, steady and slow, and nudged her forward with the grace of a soldier off duty, but never unaware. She stepped up. No microphone, no pre-written speech, just wind and birdsong, and the hush of people waiting for something real. Aria took a breath. Her voice, when it came, was soft, uncertain at first, but it held. "My mom used to say that trees don't grow fast," she began, eyes down, "but they always know which way is up." Someone sniffled in the crowd. "She said the ground remembers what we do to it and what we try to heal." A pause. Echo sat just behind her, head lifted like he was listening too. I think people are like that too." She looked out then, not at the crowd, but past them, to the creek, to the scarred ground now full of green promise. This tree is for her, for the places she tried to save, for the things we almost forgot to protect, and for those who couldn't speak, but still tried. She looked down at Echo. "He never left me, even when I couldn't talk, even when it hurt. He listened." A beat. Then, "So now, I want to be someone who listens back." Silence. Then the wind picked up, as if answering, and as the applause slowly rose, quiet, steady, and respectful, Aria stepped back, took Echo's leash gently, and sat beside the tree they'd planted together. Not to mark an end, but to begin something rooted, something that would grow. The house was quiet again, not the fragile quiet of before, the kind that made every creak sound like a warning, but a softer kind. The kind that wraps around you like a blanket, not a threat. The kind that says, "You're safe now." A fire crackled low in the hearth. The scent of pine smoke clung gently to the corners of the living room, drifting up toward the old picture frames above the mantel. Most of them dusted, some still holding shadows. Upstairs, the hallway nightlight hummed faintly, casting a warm amber glow outside Aria's door. And by the window at the end of that hallway, stretched across the faded rug like a sentinel in the dark, lay Echo. He was still, eyes closed, ears twitching now and then. Every few minutes his chest rose with a slow, deep breath, the kind of breathing that only came when a soldier knew the battle was over, at least for tonight. The moonlight poured through the window, silvering the gray along his muzzle. He didn't flinch when a branch tapped the glass, didn't move when an owl called across the hills. But when Aria turned a page upstairs, he opened one eye, just to check. She was still awake. In her room, Aria sat cross-legged at her desk, the lamp casting a golden pool of light over the final page of her notebook. The notebook wasn't fancy, just a spiral-bound thing with a bent corner and a few smudges, but to her, it was sacred. It held drawings, clues, memories, maps. Crayon-sketched trails, coded marks only she and Echo understood. Scribbled phrases like "follow the wind" and Creekstone second from the left. But tonight there was no more to map, no more to uncover. Just one page left. She pressed her pencil gently to the paper and wrote, "Mom showed me the truth. Echo helped me say it." She stopped, looked at it, then added beneath it in smaller print, "Some heroes don't need medals. They just stay." Downstairs, Sarah stood quietly in the kitchen, watching the porch light flicker. She held a mug of tea, untouched. Every so often she'd glance toward the stairs, listening, not with worry, but with the instinct of a mother who no longer had to sleep with one ear open, yet probably always would. Echo stirred once, only to rise, walk down the hall, and nudge Arya's bedroom door open with his nose. Inside, she'd just closed her notebook. She looked up and smiled. He padded over to her, rested his head on her lap. She ran a hand over his ear, then leaned down and whispered something only he heard. Then she crawled into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. He lay at her feet, facing the door, guarding, watching, still. Outside, Havenbrook slept, but one window glowed faintly with the steady breath of healing, and beneath that window a retired K-9 kept his final promise, to stay. The morning sun filtered through the canopy like liquid gold. Each step along the trail behind the house stirred the fallen leaves, sending soft rustles through the hush of the woods. Autumn had turned the world into a watercolor of amber, russet, and fading green. The trees no longer looked haunted, just wise. And on that trail, the one that wound along the creek and disappeared into the hills like a memory, two figures walked side by side. Arya's boots crunched gently over the earth, her small hand clutching the worn leather leash. But the leash was loose. Echo didn't need leading. He walked at her pace, every so often glancing up, not for permission, just to check in, as if to say, "I'm still here," as if to ask, "You good?" And she was. For the first time in a long time, she really was. They paused at the old stump near the split in the trail where the trees opened to the bend in the creek. This was where Nora used to stand, where Echo would sit so still beside her that he could have been carved from stone. Arya had been here before, but always behind them. Now she stood where her mother once stood. Echo circled once, then lay down at her feet. His breath was steady, his eyes gentle. The scar on his leg faded, now caught a glint of sunlight. Arya knelt beside him. "I think she knew," she whispered. He lifted his head slightly. "That you'd find your way back to me." She brushed her fingers over the fur between his eyes. "Let's go home, partner." They rose. No fanfare. No grand farewell. Just the sound of boots and paws on dirt. The trail behind them didn't vanish, but it didn't call either. It had given what it came to give. As they reached the clearing, a gust of wind stirred the trees above. Dozens of golden leaves detached at once, twirling like soft confetti. Arya tilted her face up, letting them fall on her shoulders, her hair, the crown of Echo's back. He didn't shake them off. He just walked. With her. A girl and her dog. Not toward justice, not toward battle, but toward healing, toward peace, toward home. And as the camera slowly pulled back, rising above the trail, the trees, the fading shimmer of creek water below, there was only this, a promise kept, and two silhouettes walking into the quiet kind of forever that waits when love never truly leaves. In a world often marked by noise and division, stories like Aria and Echoes remind us of the quiet, powerful truths that endure: loyalty, courage, and the unspoken bond between a child and a dog who refused to give up. Echo wasn't just a German shepherd. He was a promise, a protector, a witness, and most of all, a bridge between the love of a mother gone too soon and the strength of a daughter learning to find her voice again. This story isn't just about uncovering corruption or surviving loss. It's about healing, about trust, rebuilt in paw prints and whispers. It shows us that sometimes heroes don't wear badges or carry weapons. Sometimes they walk on four legs, scarred but unbroken, and led us, quietly, patiently back to ourselves. If you've ever loved a dog, you understand. And if you haven't yet, maybe one day a pair of eyes like Echoes will find you. Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is a soft nudge, a steady gaze, and the silent promise, "I'm not going anywhere." To every echo out there, thank you. And to every heart still healing, you're not alone.